Yeah, fantastic to see you on Real Vision.
Thank you for having me.
Look, you've got a really, really interesting story, and there's lots I want to dig in with you. But first, I'd love to know a bit about you, where you came from, how you got where you are today.
Well, I mean, just quickly, I'm Yat, I'm the chairman of Animoca Brands. I actually started really my sort of tech career really as a kid. I grew up in Austria from a family of musicians. I actually have a music degree. That's kind of the slightly different approach to my life, but it wasn't really my choice. It was really my mother's choice for me, really, who was also a professional musician. But it was because of music that I actually got into the whole tech space. I wasn't particularly gifted, and music is one of those things where you can really tell if someone is actually really good at it or not. And I certainly was one that sort of really got there just because I had to work really, really hard. And then I discovered the computer, and I realized that through the computer, I can cheat a little because I'm actually able to compose faster than my peers because I wrote some software back then on an early computer called the Atari ST. It had MIDI ports. And so I used the keyboard, which already back then in Vienna was sort of sacrilege, which would allow me to sort of play music on it, sort of create sort of digital notes, as it were, versions of it, which I didn't have to sort of handwrite, but essentially just edit on the computer. And that gave me a little bit of a sort of, let's say, composition advantage, which didn't really help me with school per se. But what it did do was I put the software on public domain on a platform called CompuServe at the time. And CompuServe was kind of like this pre-internet sort of service where people would share information, through an acoustic coupler and a modem, and they discovered my software. And back then, what people would do is they would write sort of, if you like the software, come send me some money. And it was really just bragging rights. It wasn't about actually making money. And I was a kid; it was just to show off a little bit. And then I started getting checks in the mail. And I was like, wow. And I didn't even have a bank account. And that was kind of the start of my sort of tech entrepreneurial quasi career. And that's how Atari found me as well. Basically said, hey, we like the software that you built. Why don't you come work for us? Because, programmers were not easy to find, especially in that part of the world. And then I waltzed into the office. I was like maybe 13 years old. And I was also in
13.
13, yes. I mean, I was a kid, right? 13
Wow.
years old. And also, I was an Asian kid from Austria. No, I speak German fluently, but you got to imagine the scene in the 80s, right, where there's just not that many Chinese or Asian people generally around. And then I waltz in and everyone's like, who are you and what's this? But that was sort of the attraction about technology and sort of the, I guess, pre-internet and then internet, because, you were able to sort of really just be judged by sort of, what you knew and what you could do. It didn't matter what you looked like. It didn't matter sort of the fact that you were a kid or an adult, whatever it was, right? Your digital persona was really, and your skills were really what was identified to you. And anyway, that sort of long story in terms of sort of got me into the technology space. Then I ended up studying computer science in the US because Atari said, well, we need to brush up your skills. Then Atari went under. And basically, all of us became unemployed. And that was the beginning of my true entrepreneurial career because a bunch of ex-Atari guys came together of really where I only met one person in real life. We communicated everything back then over CompuServe and then Genie, which was another kind of pre-internet service where we would trade software and code and really service ex-Atari customers who didn't have any sort of ways to service their hardware anymore and their software. So we had sort of this service that supported them. And that ultimately got me sort of to Hong Kong, where my father's from. And I started one of Hong Kong's very first internet service providers called Hong Kong Online. This was in 1993. And again, it was a little
Wow.
early, right? It was actually, if you think about it, really a terrible business idea because there were really maybe only 30 or 40,000 people who were actually on the internet. Everyone else was on like services like AOL or CompuServe, like sort of those type of walled gardens internet services. But for me, it was just like the obvious thing. I said, oh, everyone must have the internet, so let me bring it to you, right? Of course, nobody wanted it back then. But I found myself always early in those waves. We built a cloud computing business in '98. We sold that later to IBM in 2009. Then we got into mobile gaming in 2011. And really, that was the beginning of Animoca Brands as we went from mobile gaming ultimately into blockchain gaming.
So, what was the idea with Animoca? I mean, what an incredible career so far. What was the idea with Animoca when you built it? What was your vision when you started, and how's that changed over time as blockchain has become a part of this whole ecosystem?
So the original Animoca really started in 2000 and 2000, late 2010, 2011. And one interesting tidbit that you can probably find out if you go online is we're actually one of the top mobile game developers back in 2011 when there was actually only a very small number of mobile game developers. We created a hit title called Pretty Pet Salon. And we quickly figured out that by sort of making mobile apps on really what was the sort of iOS device back then, the Apple iPhone, that if we kept releasing a new app almost every week, we would always be able to be at the top of the charts, right? So we basically essentially figured out a way in which we were able to sort of, I guess, sort of get presence. It was just a form of, call it sort of marketing hack, if you will, but we figured out how to do that. Of course, there were no rules at the time, which led us to some problems later on. But anyway, we got into mobile games early because we saw that the mobile device was very powerful. And in fact, the way we got into the mobile device was I actually had my first child sort of a few years before. And I never wanted to carry on these crazy big ass sort of flashcards, right? 20 flashcards, and they were like literally buckets of these sort of cards. And, they go over them in like 5 minutes and 10 minutes, and then they need another set of flashcards. So you would have like literally like 200 of these flashcards. So I said, well, why don't we just put this into this mobile device? And I remember the team back then saying, why would anyone put $1,000 device to a toddler? Like they're just going to chew it and throw it around. Instead, I said, fine, no problem, just do it for me. So they ended up building this application, which had these flashcards, basically really just flashcards on the screen. And it worked like magic. Basically I was actually able to have a peaceful lunch, right? And I thought everything was fine, and just for my own selfish reasons. And then 2 months later, the developer came to me and said, "Do you know what happened?" I said, "I don't know what happened." It was called Baby Flashcards. It was the first free flashcard app on the App Store. So it was like downloaded millions of times. And that's kind of when we realized, wait, I think the App Store is really interesting. And clearly a lot more people agreed with the idea of having a sort of a mobile flashcard on super expensive phones seemed to be a good idea, right? Anyway, that awoke in us the potential of the mobile phone. And so we went headlong into that. But just to conclude that story, what happened was we ended up getting so successful that 12 out of the top 20 apps were from Animoca. And Apple didn't like that. And so they promptly banned all of our apps in January of 2012.
Wow.
And the reason they never gave us an official reason. They said that we were spamming the App Store, but they deplatformed us entirely because, first of all, we're based out of Hong Kong, which is, some parts of Asia, right? As far as I guess someone in Cupertino was concerned. I never got to find out who the person was. There was no decision making. There was no appeals. It was just, we removed you. Of course, we called, we begged, we did everything to try to stay. And that was sort of our sort of really first big lesson of what it was like to be on a centralized platform that essentially controlled your fate. It took us 2 years to get back on the App Store. We ended up building a reasonable business on Android, but never were able to recapture sort of our sort of leadership in mobile gaming that we had in 2011, 2012 because of that. So that's one of the big reasons why we're sort of, we love decentralization and blockchain.
So when did you first discover blockchain? Tell me that story. Your kind of journey into the crypto sphere.
So blockchain, especially Bitcoin mining and early forms of actually Dogecoin, was actually sort of a discovery really of sort of interest. It was more intellectual. Where it really became something which sort of awoke our interest was CryptoKitties. So one of the backstories of how we got into this is that we actually acquired a business in Vancouver that actually was involved in helping build CryptoKitties. Its co-founder ultimately became the co-founder of Dapper Labs. And that led us to becoming one of the earliest shareholders in Dapper Labs and a holder of Flow and the first publisher of CryptoKitties in Asia, really in Greater China, in January of 2018. CryptoKitties launched in November 2017, right? That's how fast, sort of we ventured in when we saw the potential of that. And so it was really CryptoKitties that sort of awoke sort of this sort of interest in, what was non-fungible tokens. And non-fungible tokens was really kind of obscure at that time. It was more sort of this curious sort of technology that blockchain could serve. But most mainstream blockchain people were not interested in NFTs at the time. But we fell in love completely with this idea that people could own their digital assets. And we were less interested in the sort of value of Bitcoin because we were less about, our background was less financial in that sense. So while we understood it to some degree, it didn't attract us. But non-fungible tokens, we were in love with right away because it sort of gave gamers their rights, their ownership. For anyone who's played MMORPGs or multi-user dungeons, back in the 90s, right? we were already trading assets for real money. And then the server would shut down and we would be like, oh my goodness, I lost everything, right? And that was sort of one of those things that really attracted us into the space. And we always believed that gaming could actually drive blockchain adoption to the masses. And really, non-fungible tokens would be this paradigm that allowed people to have actual digital ownership of their assets. So yeah, so that's how we got really big into the space. And then we never looked back.
Hey, if you like this clip, be sure to check out the full interview and more only on realvision.com/crypto. It's 100% free. Sign up now.